everybody, and as they say in the movies, take two. For those of you who were at the webinar on Tuesday, we got halfway through and we had what's referred to as a broadcast storm. What that caused is for our whole phone and internet system to go down. Terrible, terrible thing. And poor Freddie, who organised things, our Australian Childhood Trauma Group, was desperately running around trying to get things up again. Unfortunately, it took us half a day to get back to where we were before. So we apologise to those who were in the webinar at the time. There were 83 of you, and everything disappeared, and we tried to get things back on the phone. And what we've decided to do is to shoot the whole thing again. This time it's just me. I'm on my own. There's no audience out there, and you'll have an opportunity to watch this in your own time, wherever you are, in your spa bath, somewhere out in the bush where you've got internet access, or perhaps in your office with a group of your colleagues. Well, welcome back. My plan is to quickly move through the first part of the seminar just to bring us back up to date again. If you weren't at the webinar and you're watching this on Tuesday, you may not understand anything I'm talking about in relation to this thing called a broadcast storm. Basically, it's a short circuit. One of our staff plugged in a telephone in the wrong socket and it brought the whole place down. But that's okay. We'll get back to where we need to be. The important thing is, if you weren't in the webinar, I'm going to be going a bit more quickly through the first part of the webinar. You might need to watch it a couple of times, or once we get to the practice models, you'll understand exactly what's going on. At least that's what I'm hoping. One of the things we did, and I'd like to do again, is we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're standing on, both here in Fitzroy and sunny Melbourne. I know some of you not in Melbourne will be chuckling at that. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and those who may be elders into the future. If you happen to be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island, well, First Nations people watching this redo of the webinar, I'd particularly like to thank you for allowing me to be on this land today where I am, but also to thank you for the last 40 years of my life. I've had a few years not here, over in my original home country where I was born in Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. Came here in 1980. I'd like to thank you for allowing me to have 40 wonderful years on your traditional lands. Okay, so let's get started. Oh, excuse me. One thing I did say is that I've just recently turned 60. It was a couple of weeks ago in April, and my wife tells me that allows me to now officially become a grumpy old man. And I was talking about, there are two things I'm grumpy about. One, I don't understand, after 40 years of the career I've had, how it is that homelessness in Victoria and other parts of Australia is still in the situation that we cannot say that there are fewer people who are homeless today than there were 40 years ago. Why is it that people who are homeless, they find themselves in very vulnerable situation, most often not because of their own doing? We do not have the resources in the place that people can go for safety. That's the first thing I'm really grumpy about. The second thing I'm grumpy about is that in 40 years of my career, one of the areas I've worked in for quite some time is with children and young people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, or sometimes referred to as complex trauma. How is it that after 40 years we can't categorically say that a child leaving the out-of-home sector today is better off than when they left 40 years ago? Some time ago, a minister, when I asked this question in a public forum, I said, how come we don't have anything that tells us this, and why are our systems not developed enough where we can now say things are better? Their response to me was to say, I like to be optimistic. It's not good enough that we're just optimistic. We need to see fundamental change in our sectors so that vulnerable people are given the best opportunity to contribute to society in a meaningful way, and in particular where they feel safe and secure. So that's my premise that gets us started in the seminar. The other thing we did, excuse me, is I showed you a video. I gave you a link to a video on Dadiri. I'll give that link towards the end of the seminar, and if you'd like to look at it, that link is, you'll have an opportunity to do that in your own time. But Dadiri is fundamental to the work we do. If you're working as a psychologist, a social worker, counsellor, psychotherapist, welfare worker, youth worker, case manager, even I'd bring teachers into that and teacher support staff. If you're working with people, then fundamental to this work is you understand the concept of Dadiri that's come to us from our First Nations people. Dadiri tells us that before you do anything, you have to breathe. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, why in the world do you have to breathe first? Yeah, we all do that naturally. Breathing helps us to stay in our thinking mind. Of course, a special kind of breathing, that is. Breathing that allows us to feel calm, grounded and centered. Helps us to stay in our thinking mind. I don't know if anyone's ever told you this before, but you really only have one tool in the work that you and I do. And that tool is your mind, the power of your mind. And your ability to stay in your thinking mind rather than slipping into your reptilian brain will determine the outcomes for your clients or participants or whatever name you give to the particular people you're giving service to. This is critically important. Now, in psychology and psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, there's a concept known as the frame. And the frame I'm going to talk about throughout this seminar is about how you hold yourself in the work. It's not just about your internal state, but it also includes the external state, the environment that you create around a client for you and them to be able to do this work. I shall come back to it. But Dadiri, in a sense, is a way, or at least part of a way, of creating the frame that is needed for you to be able to do this work. The second thing that Miriam said in regard to Dadiri is, apart from breathing, you need to be able to listen deeply. Now, why is listening deeply so important? Well, for those of you who have done Counselling 101, you'll understand it, the ability to empathise, to hear what a person is saying, to make sense of it, reflect back to that person that you understand what they're saying. The thing is, listening deeply is not just about what you hear out there. In fact, maybe more importantly, listening deeply is about what you hear inside yourself when you're in a relationship with another person. What you hear inside yourself. And again, we're going to come back to this when we think about your own story. That is, what's happened in you? What's your narrative around this work? What's the journey you've had that brings you into this work? The other thing is that when you can listen deeply, when you can pay attention to what's happening in you and pay attention to what's happening out there at the same time, it gives you the best opportunity to connect. And again, as part of the tools that you have in your work, once you can connect into your mind and use your mind in that thinking mind state, it enables you to connect. And connection is critically important in our work. I'll be talking about this in relation to what's known as the therapeutic alliance. That is an alliance you create between self and other. Self being you, of course, and other being your client. It could also, though, be your colleague. The relationship you have between colleagues can also come into this. And the final thing, and probably the most important thing that Miriam said, she said, you cannot hurry the river. You cannot hurry the river. Change takes time. And it's unfortunate in the work we do very often, we're not given the time to create the change. Because people out there are saying, come on, we need to see outcomes, we need to see them today. And of course, this creates a tension often between the worker and possibly between leadership groups who are having to put in the stats to say, you know, what have you done? But it does take time to create change, and I'm going to tell you about how long it takes in one of the practice models that we'll talk about. The plan is to explore evidence-informed practice frameworks for us to use in our day-to-day work. So evidence-informed practice models are models you can actually, they're not just theoretical models, they're taken from theory, but enables you to use them in your day-to-day practice. Will enhance, hopefully, your understanding of the differences between a mind open for change and a brain focused on survival. You've seen me already using my hand like this, and this is a neat little trick to be able to talk about thinking mind and reptilian brain. Hopefully, we'll cultivate an awareness of your own responses when working with another's pain. Now, this work is painful. And by painful, when I'm talking about that, I don't mean painful as in, oh, I don't know, I have to go to work again. Not that kind of painful. The reality is, if you're a worker working with people in vulnerable situations, you will experience their pain and you will experience your own sense of their pain. Now, sometimes this can get in our way of being able to do good work, and I'll explain that a little bit later. I also want to foster a more direct and focused approach to exploring with clients what are they good at and what do they like to do. I call this the leverage point. If I can find something in a client that provides me with an opportunity to do some deeper work, then I'm going to look for it. Now, for young people, an adolescent, it might be walking through a park, kicking a ball, listening to music, making music with them, whatever it is that gives you a leverage to understand their world, you need to find it. And finally, identify some challenges in working with COVID-19 environments, because the reality is the way we go about doing our work has changed. For those of you who are working with clients who can access such things as technology, maybe you've been able to have meetings with them a bit like I'm doing this webinar. But for those of you who are working with vulnerable populations who don't have access to technology, then we have to find creative ways with which to stay in contact with them and ensure they don't feel dropped by us. The other thing we did is we talked about knowledge and practice. Now, it's a really interesting thing. As I said, that most of you, if not, well, it should be everybody really, if you're in this work, you have this amount of knowledge that you've gained through trainings, that you've gained through your degrees, that you've gained through personal experience, that you've gained from having conversations with people and possibly through supervision. The challenge around knowledge is how do we translate it into our practice? Because it's a waste of time to go to training, and it will be a waste of time to listen to this video, spend 45 minutes or an hour listening to this video and discovering at the end, sort of gone through one ear and out the other. I did that, I should have done that. Through one ear and out the other ear. What you need to be able to do is translate it into practice. And one of the challenges is about the bridge between, or to cross the bridge rather, between practice and knowledge. Because crossing that bridge requires you to have some level of personal insight. And how do we gain personal insight? We tend to gain personal insight probably by going at times to talk to somebody else or doing some very deep inner reflection. The only dilemma is when you do deep inner reflection on your own, who knows if you're kind of taking up the challenge to listen to what you're learning about yourself. It's one of the reasons we do go and see psychotherapists or counsellors, so that we have somebody independent from ourselves who's reflecting back the things that we're thinking about. I am of the belief, and this might be a challenge to some of you, I am of the belief that everyone coming into this field, that is the field working with other vulnerable populations, irrespective of working with children, adults, or anybody else of this ilk, we probably should, as part of our learning and training, do our own personal psychotherapy. Yep, and if you want to know for how long, probably 1 to 2 years, as a kind of a minimum. Because, and the reason for this is when you're in this work, and you're with a client who is telling you their story, is expressing to you possibly in some logical sequence, or possibly they might appear to you to be ranting and raving, or they might even be swearing and cursing you, saying, fuck off, you can't tell me what to do, etc. My apologies for those people who don't like my swear words, but it's just in training. You see, if you can't stay present, when all this energy that a client can sometimes give off, I call it energy, other people refer to it as transference or projection. That is, we have stuff that we don't like and we try and parcel it up and give it to somebody else, such as the therapist or the caseworker. If you can't stay in the presence of the client when they're doing this, you're going to have some problems. And the way you learn to stay present is actually to stay present with yourself when you're telling your own story to somebody. Because very often when we're telling our own story, we might want to sort of avoid certain things. We call it sort of our defensive mechanisms that get in the way. We want to talk about our anxieties, our traumas, our childhood experiences and so forth, what you didn't get from your mother or your father or your brother or your sister or whoever it happens to be. But I think the greatest learning that I ever had was not in my degrees. It didn't happen in my degrees. It happened when I was either lying on a couch or sitting in a chair with somebody else and telling them about my lot, sometimes whinging and complaining about my lot. That was my greatest learning. Because I'm much more aware when I'm with a client when something comes up in me, when my own feelings come up in me, I'm much better able to think, is this mine or is it the client who's projected it into me? And if it's mine, I say to myself, that's for me to deal with somewhere else, in supervision or with friends or somebody else. But if it comes up in me and I think this belongs to the client and my mind is open, it gives me an opportunity then to use it to possibly move forward with that particular client. It might even give me an opportunity to challenge the client if that's necessary. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. One of the questions we asked was, well, what about what you doubt in life? It seems to me that what we doubt in life is a little bit random. When you're born, you don't get a choice. You don't get a choice to choose your parents. You don't get a choice to choose your siblings, generally speaking. You're born and the universe determines what's going to happen to you at the start. This is sometimes referred to as an external locus control. You're reliant on the universe to give you what you need. The unfortunate thing is the universe is not always kind to us. The universe is not always kind. And some people in their growing up have adverse childhood experiences that then impact their adulthoods in all sorts of different ways. So one of the big questions I asked was that, does where I have come from have to be who I am or who I become? Now everyone out there, every time I've asked this question when there's been hundreds of people in a room, it's a resounding no. And then I turn around and say, well, actually the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Where you have come from will determine who you are unless something happens around you that creates a different trajectory. Now we know this because of some science, and I talked to you about what's known as the adverse childhood experience study. And what they did is that adults coming into GPs, they gave them a questionnaire that had 10 things on that questionnaire. It asked them, have you ever experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, exposure to domestic violence, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and someone in the household was incarcerated at any time. It asked those 10 questions. And we actually did a poll on this to ask you, well, what do you think? Compared to the normal population, you had 6 or more ACEs. What would be the likelihood that you'd become an intravenous drug user? In other words, compared to the normal population, people who didn't have any ACEs, those who had 6 or more. And I asked, is it 80% more, or is it 100% more, 200, etc.? And the answer is 4,600%. If you've had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, then as an adult, and by adult, young adult, adolescent, young adult into adulthood, there's 4,600% chance that you'll become an intravenous drug user. I asked about the likelihood of 1 or more suicide attempts. The likelihood is 3,100 to 5,000%. It's not 20% more, it's not 80% more, it's not 200% more. It's 3,100 to 5,000%. That you're going to be a smoker, the chances of you becoming a smoker increases 1,600%. 1,600%. And that's why I say the answer is not no to does your childhood determine who you might become, because it does unless you're fortunate enough to find workers such as yourself that can intervene in that trajectory. And the rest of this webinar really brings us up to date about where we're going to go with this, because what we're trying to think about is what are the models of practice that can help us ensure that trajectory is different. That a child's narrative does not have to determine who they become, but rather they determine how their narrative gets played out into their adulthood. And the difference between them determining how that narrative gets played out, or the narrative determining who they become, is up to you. It's you. And the frame you create around the work you do. So the first model we're going to talk about is known as, or at least I refer to as the therapeutic alliance. In Dadiri, or Miriam Rose talked about connection. The therapeutic alliance is your ability to create a connection between self and other. And it is central to the work. It is central to the work. And this connection that you create comes about through your ability to ensure a non-judgmental and unconditional love approach to the client-centered work. Non-judgmental and unconditional love to the client-centered work. Now, because connection is so important, this practice model is called joining together. Fundamentally, the first thing one has to do when you come across or you're referred a new client, one of the things you need to do is to create this frame. As I said before, the frame is something that is not just about what's happening for you inside. It's not just about your value system as a worker. It's about the frameworks or models that you use to do your work, but still that's not everything. It's about the environment you create around the client. Now, again, that might be an office. Now, I'd give you a little clue. If you are working in an office and you bring clients into your office, I'd like you to take your colleagues for a little walk around your office and just see whether or not your office maximizes the work you might be doing with a client. Is it old, drab, worn? Is there broken furniture about? In the therapy rooms, do they have any, if you have seen children or young people, are there any things in there that they might be able to give some focus to their attention? Is your entry welcoming? Are all the paintings on the walls all crooked, or there's nothing on the walls? Creating an environment is critically important. I do have another presentation called Homes That Heal, which talks about this. But I just want you to think a little bit about how you create the frame around yourself. Now, the first thing about joining together is that it doesn't just happen automatically. The first phase of relationship building I refer to as reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. So why is this important? Well, believe it or not, relationships, unless you're on a TV show, don't just happen automatically. That is, you don't one day get up, you see someone in the street and go over and say, will you marry me? As I said, it only happens on a TV show. So what does happen? How do relationships form? Well, there's a process to them. And the first part of this process is called reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. From a client's point of view, they're trying to work out, are you a safety threat? That is, are you going to hurt them physically or psychologically in some way? Are you an easy mark? That is, can they get stuff off of you? So they might say to you, well, I'll tell you what's happening to me if you go and buy me a burger. Or if you give me your watch, I'll talk to you. And there, believe it or not, there are some people out there, workers, who go, I just want to get through this, and therefore I'll give them what they need. A good example, there's a guy called Bayland, who was a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist some years ago. But one of the things he discovered, he first worked with GPs and then went on to work with others. What he discovered is that the reason he set up these groups called, now known as Bayland groups, because GPs were coming to him and complaining about their patients. And basically, instead of engaging with their patients, they were just handing over scripts. Whatever they wanted, they would give to their patient. This is known as an easy mark, because they didn't know how to sit with their client in the presence of the client's pain. Now, if you're not an easy mark, you could also be irrelevant. Some clients will look at you and say, you've got nothing to offer me, so why should I listen to what you have to say? You do not want to be irrelevant in relation to a client, because you will not get the outcomes you or the client are seeking. The only person that you can be, if you're going to move through this process of joining together, is referred to as the interpersonal threat. The interpersonal threat, another name for this, an easy way to understand it, is the captain of the ship or the driver of the school bus. The client needs to know that you have something to offer them. The client is likely to be desperate to find somebody in their life that can both understand their story, that they can tell their narrative, and help and have someone who's going to be the witness to that story. But of course, they need to test that out. So very often clients first put in place what we refer to as border incursions. And border incursions get worse before they get better. Border incursions can be simple things where the client keeps turning up late or doesn't turn up at all. Border incursions can be the client has a meltdown in front of you to see what you do in response. They might even threaten you. What they're trying to understand is, because the world is unpredictable for them, they want to know if they come to you in different states of psychological, emotional well-being, that you're going to be able to manage it, and then you're not going to run away, that you're going to be able to stay present with them and help them through those moments. Now, to keep in mind, this model that you're using is also true for you. You have your own reconnaissance intelligence gathering, and you will put your own border incursions in place towards the client, if not consciously, unconsciously. Hopefully, though, if you're a good worker, your reconnaissance intelligence gathering is trying to work with the client to understand what's happening for them and to make sense of the way that they operate in relationships. Your border incursions more relate to your ability to offer up challenges to the client about their presentation. Now, normally, if we're talking about challenges, you don't want to be doing it here just early on in the relationship, because you'll turn the client away. The final part of this model is what's referred to as joining together. So this section here is where you want to be. You notice that as the relationship develops between you and your client, as it becomes stronger, reconnaissance and intelligence gathering begins to drop away, and so do these border incursions or testing behavior. But this is where you need to be. Now, unfortunate thing is, to get into this territory here, but to be solidly in it, so we're talking about from this point here, it takes about 12 to 18 months. Now, that's a long time. Many of you will be saying, well, I don't get that long to work with clients. What I'm telling you is really what the research tells us about the ability to form strong, meaningful, and therapeutic relationships. And for all of those who have poo-hooed psychoanalysis for so many years, they knew about this. The psychoanalytic process does take time, because what you're doing is you're building a fundamental relationship between self and other. Now, it is possible to speed up this joining together experience. And we do that through our ability to provide deep and advanced levels of empathy, to be able to stay very present, to demonstrate our genuineness and our desire to help the client, and our ability to be there when they are most in need. This also means, it's one of the reasons I said to you earlier, that it's important for us not to have our own personal histories come into the work. We can be aware of our personal histories, but it's for us to deal with in some other place. We would have a poll. What's the strongest feeling associated with homelessness? Powerful feeling that can create a lot of unfortunate damage for people psychologically. Judith Atkinson knew a lot about this, and what I'm talking about is what Judith created this model called the circle of shame. Now, shame's an interesting emotion. Shame actually helps us to govern our behaviors in some way. It helps us to operate in the world in a sort of pro-social way, because most of us don't like, if not everybody, don't like to experience shame. We don't like to feel belittled, and we like to operate in ways that are more cooperative rather than ways that push us away. However, those who experience very deep shame, such as people who are homeless, children who have adverse childhood experience, complex, those who have experienced torture, often end up caught in a cycle where they actually have a deep belief that what has happened to them is entirely their fault. And society reinforces this belief at times. You only need to watch someone who's a rough sleeper sitting out on the street and possibly trying to get some funds or even food to just get by, and watch the people when they walk by, they look at them, whether they stop and engage, whether they roll their eyes, or whether they say something that's not polite. When people get caught in the circle of shame, four things can happen. The person might withdraw from themselves and basically from the world, sometimes referred to as alienation, isolation, even dissociation. They simply withdraw. Usually the people like this have very high levels of anxiety and find it very difficult. While this is important, is that at some point in your career, you may come across a person who is doing this. What's important is that you understand that this feeling or experience they have is not really so much anxiety, it's the anxiety of experiencing shame in your presence. And why would somebody feel anxious or shameful in your presence? Because they might have a sense that you're going to be judging them of their circumstances that they find themselves in. The second one is attack to self. So people can do this in a number of ways, but probably the one that's most known to you is self-harm. People who might cut, people might pull their hair out, known as trichotillomania. The other one is avoidance. Again, the one that is probably known to you is substance abuse, the taking of illicit or illicit drugs in order to try and make the pain just go away. And the final one that can be most challenging to many of us out there in the world is attack of others, which might be seen in bullying behaviour, deliberately destroying relationships, and of course in violence to other people. One of the things that I find interesting about this model and helpful in my work is to determine with clients that I see, in terms of the circle of shame, how this gets projected out. Are they more likely to be clients who attack self, withdraw, avoid, or attack others? Now, you may come across clients who experience all of these things in different ways, but usually there is a predominant way that they will present in the world. One of the things I just remembered, I just want to go back for a moment to, if I can go back, I want to go back to this model momentarily, because one of the things I neglected to say, which I said a bit about in the circle of shame, is that this model can be used as, literally in your day-to-day work, as a wee bit of an assessment where you are in relation to the client in terms of your therapeutic alliance with that client. Because there are certain behaviours they will exhibit and certain behaviours you'll exhibit that will tell you where you are. Do not presume that within 2 or 3 weeks of working with a client, just because it seems going well, that you have strong connection and trusting connection with a client in 2 or 3 weeks. It just doesn't happen. We can believe it so, and this will often set ourselves up to fail and that of the client. In the same way that, as I've said, this can be used, this model, practice model, the circle of shame, can be used to determine where the client is in relation to others, such as yourself. What I'd like to do now is to move on to practice model number 3. And this model was initially developed by, through Judith Herman's work around complex post-traumatic stress. You would have no doubt heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. We put a complex in front of it when we're talking about not someone who's just experienced one event that is traumatic, but when you have a person who's living through traumatic events again and again and again and again. Children who might be growing up in a household where there's violence, mental health issues, abuse of drugs, sexual, physical, emotional abuse and neglect. And this goes on not just for weeks or even months, but possibly for years. The traumatic experience becomes rather complex. And how we deal with it is much more than simply of having a therapy session and 6 sessions and away you go, you're all back together again. This model is called the sequential framework for change. Again, right throughout these models I'm showing you, these models help us create that frame I spoke of earlier. The frame being a little bit like, some of you may have heard of the word gestalt. The gestalt is the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. So in this case, the frame is everything that you do around the client that progresses the client into a better place, into a place of healing, into a place of being able to make a contribution to society, the community that they would like to. And where their shame doesn't govern how they operate in the world, but they determine how they're going to do that. Judith Herman, and this will be no surprise to most of you, if not all of you, suggests that before we do any work, we have to create a safe and secure environment. Now, of course, this can be rather difficult if you're working again with people living on the streets, who are rough sleepers, who are in substandard accommodation facilities and rundown boarding houses and the like, which may not be safe. This can be at times problematic. But even where it's challenging to do, we have to find a way to create a safe and secure environment. And it's the frame that can help us to do this. Where you're able to create a safe psychological, emotional with your client, and it might be in a park. It might be sitting on a step somewhere outside a building. In that place, you can, for a time, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, or beyond, you can create the frame around the client. Now, from a client's point of view, how they experience this frame, and I have to say I can only talk about it when I was a client sitting with a psychoanalyst doing my work, what it feels like. Frame, and what it feels like for the client generally, is it feels a little bit like someone's wrapped a warm blanket around you and you've got a heat pack, feeling nice and comfy and incredibly safe. In a sense, that's what the frame does. It creates a moment in time, a space in time where a client can actually then begin to tell you about their story. sometimes referred to as processing. And ultimately, that's what we want our clients to be able to do, for them to understand that you are willing to be witness to their story. And I have to say, I have felt most honoured in my role as a psychotherapist at those times when a client has had the courage to share their story with me, that I feel honoured that I have been the chosen person to be witness to their story for a moment in time. In order to move forward, and in a sense to overcome such things as complex trauma, you have to find a way to process your story or your narrative. And generally speaking, that will be through discussions that you'll have with someone who's hopefully going to help you along the way, along your journey. Why is processing so important? Why is the telling of the story so important? Because the telling of the story allows us to then integrate that story into the whole person. And this becomes important, coming back to my point, because we want ultimately the client to be able to determine how their history gets played out in their life, rather than their history determining who they are. Going back to the child, does where I've come from have to be who I am? If you want it to be no, then you need to find a space with which your client can feel safe and secure, can process their story, and then over time for it to be integrated. Now I can tell you this, it doesn't happen in successions. Anything you do with a client can be therapeutic. If you go shopping with a client, if you sit for 30 seconds with a client, depending on how you create that frame in that very small period of time. But here's the thing, to sit with the client, Balint, we're coming back to Balint, said, don't just do something, sit there. What I want to talk to now is about this idea of being present, how you can stay present when perhaps there's part of you that just wants to walk away. The best way I can describe this process of staying present with a client is to illustrate what happens when we don't. And the classic example, and some of you might be experiencing as you're watching this video, is when a child throws a tantrum before you, possibly out in public or possibly just inside your own home. Our natural tendency is when a child is screaming and yelling and throwing themselves on the floor, the natural tendency is wanting them to sort of stop what they're doing, and we use all sorts of devices to do that. We might use threats. We'll say, just wait till your mother comes home, or wait till your father comes home. We might threaten to take something away. Well, tonight you're not having dessert. Or we might tell them to go to their bedroom. I always think the bedroom is an interesting one when you send your child off to their bedroom, because what are you hoping will occur when they go into their bedroom? Most people, when I ask this question, they go, well, I'm hoping they'll calm down. And I think about that when a little 3-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 4 or a 5-year-old set off to their bedroom. I think magically after they've slammed the door, we think they're going to go, I've been sent to my bedroom, and I have to now do some self-reflection to better understand why I've been sent to my bedroom and why my behavior has been so appalling. I think the first thing I need to do is to do some yoga. Okay, I'm cartooning a little bit, but you get the picture. When children in particular, and young people, and I would go so far as to say vulnerable people, to some extent, vulnerable adults, when they have become dysregulated, they actually don't need to be on their own. They need someone who's willing to stay present with them, to act as their regulator, so they can go from their reptilian brain back in their thinking mind. You see, here's the thing. If you have two people, or at least one person who's in their reptilian brain and the other person's in their thinking mind, then you have the possibility of helping that person to get into their thinking mind. When you don't have that, if they're on their own, stuck in their reptilian brain, or those people around them are also in their reptilian brain, or survival mode as we sometimes call it, it's going to be very difficult for them to find a space in their mind to be able to approach the problem that they have. It's really important. And one of the ways we do this is not just to do something. Now, very often our training tells us to do. In social work and even in psychology at times, depending on the framework you're using, you're taught to do. Someone has a problem, you fix the problem. Doing is not necessarily the first thing that we should get on about. The first thing is to learn to sit. So with that tantruming child, rather than be threatening them to do certain things, with certain things, what we need to do is to learn to get back into our daduri state, to breathe, to listen deeply, to see what's happening in me. Is there something happening in me that's going to get in the way of me being able to be present with this person? And then can I connect with them even in this state? And maybe when someone is in this state, the best thing you can do to connect is to center yourself and stop talking. That's right. Just stop talking. I can tell you what you are, and you can try this on your own kids. If they are having a tantrum, what I'd like you to do is just find a space that allows you to get a bit lower. There's nothing worse than an adult standing over a child and they're having to look up your hearing nostrils. What you want to do is find, it might be to sit in a chair. If you can get down on the floor, then get down on the floor, but only if you can get back up again. To lower yourself with the child, start to breathe and wait. Now, over time, what you'll find is that tantruming child will start looking at you, wondering what's going on. They'll few more yells and screams, and then they'll finally look at you and say something like, "What are you doing?" It's the first time you speak. Before then, you shouldn't. And what you say is, "I'm breathing." They might say, "What are you doing that for?" And you can say, "Because when I breathe like this, it helps me to feel safe." Of course, to do this, you've sort of got to know where the energy of the person is you're dealing with, whether it's a child or an adult. Perhaps the model for the quadrants of therapeutic intervention. I've already talked about energy. I've talked about its transference and projection. And what I'm inviting you to do is to pay attention to the energy of your client, that which is coming off them and that you will experience somewhere in your body. For me, it tends to be in my gut, but I do know other people experience it in their head, their shoulders, anywhere. What we want to do in order to assess the energy of the client, we have to make sure that we're in our thinking mind. Not half and half, but in our thinking mind. So what you discover is as a client might be escalating. Now by escalating, two things can happen when a client escalates. They can externalize this energy, so there'll be lots of noise, potentially. They may be intimidating, they may be walking away from you, or they can internalize it. They begin to shut down and dissociate in some way. Irrespective if it's internalizing or externalizing, well, I have to say most of us in society, when I say most of us, tend to pay attention to those making the most noise. If you happen to be working with children or young people in a class environment, or even with young people who may be homeless, be aware that there will be many of those people who do not externalize their feelings and experiences of being in the world. They may be internalizers and withdraw, but this model still fits. However that escalation looks, removing yourself, having big energy, big noise coming out, there will be this energy. And this energy tends to take a trajectory that goes up, it reaches a peak and it comes down again. Again, if you go back to your tantrum child, no child tantrums forever. Although I'm sure some of you might think you've had that experience. But there is a point where they run out of energy and they come back. And this is true for everybody who may be externalizing or internalizing some big feelings in some way. Your job at this point is to try and read where that energy is. If a client comes to you and actually they are in that calmer place, in fact, in their thinking mind, this is the time for you to think proactively. How can you and the client join together, create that therapeutic alliance to get some end that they require? You notice the word TCP down there. First of all, I call a therapeutic change plan. Whether you have this as a written document or something you carry in your mind, it's really important with all clients that you have some sense of where you're heading. Having a sense of where you're heading still does not mean that you forget about the here and now. We work in the here and now, but we have some sense of where we're heading. And being proactive is a great opportunity for you to help that child or young person or adult to begin to develop the capacity to feel empowered, to be able to determine what life do they want moving forward. Now, it's a great place to work, of course, when a client is in this frame. This is the easiest place to work with the client in this frame. It's also the time when the client's likely to be most motivated and really join together for you in this common goal. Clients don't always come to us in this particular state. Sometimes they've already reached a point where their energy is higher, and you might have to think about what's the best thing for you to do now. I refer to this process as diffusion, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to shift the energy so we can help the client get back into their thinking mind. And there are different tricks of the trade to do this. One I refer to as the blue-tongue lizard intervention, which is great with kids. And I know that it works at least up until the age of 19 because I had a worker who tried this on their son at the age of 19 and it worked. They came back, gave me some feedback. The blue-tongue lizard intervention is generally speaking, if you have a child, young person in front of you who tend to be either externalizing or internalizing things, you basically look over their shoulder out a window preferably, and you say, is that a blue-tongued lizard? And you walk straight past them. And what you'll notice is people, it will just shift them from the survival brain back into their thinking mind. How does it work? Well, what happens is when you ask this question, is that a blue-tongued lizard? To answer that question, to give some thought to that question, you've got to be in your thinking mind. Try it on your children. In fact, a lot of these things I suggest that you try on your own children before you go out there and try on your clients, because you get an opportunity to see them work firsthand. Diffusion can work in all sorts of ways. Some years ago, I was working with a man who was homeless. One of his issues was he would come into the organisation that I was working at. He used to come in there and he'd be quite intimidating and threatening with me. The only thing that got him into a thinking mind space was me to ask him about his daughter, how she was doing. And straight away, he would come and was able to tell me about his daughter, and then we could then have a conversation about what we needed to. So I want you to think, I can't give you all the interventions possible, but I want you to think in terms of diffusion, this idea, and the blue-tongued lizard intervention, if you want to call it that. But don't always say, is that a blue-tongued lizard? That's just sort of the name I give to this ability for us to intervene when somebody is starting to escalate in terms of their behaviour. The reality is, clients at some point will in fact just reach the peak of this. Diffusion won't work. They may be so highly agitated, so dysregulated that they simply can't get back into their thinking minds. I call this the management phase of this quadrant. Management is when we assess for risk to self and other. Management is when we decide, do we need to call some other people in for assistance, for help. Management is also the phase that we need to let the client know we will get through this together, whatever that will take. We will get through it together, because on the other side, I want to be there with you and for you in order to complete it. At some point, that graph the energy will lower, and we end up in this place that I call restoration. Now, restoration is a really important part. Very often, sometimes when there has been a crisis and somebody comes over the other side, then pack them up and say, off you go now, before we've done this final intervention piece, which is called restoration. Restoration is to ensure the client is not leaving with an internalized great sense of shame for what they've just done. When people become dysregulated, whether internally or externally, it's normally because they have overwhelming feelings that they simply can't be in control of. It's really important that we work hard to ensure they don't feel great shame about this. They lacked the skills or capacity to manage their own situation. So restoration is about ensuring our relationship has not been damaged. It also allows us to take pause with the client to say, what is it we need to do so we don't get back into this place again? Now, the final working model I want to show you, working model, practice model 5, is really about how do we get to the doing. I call it reflecting solutions. As I said, most of us want to do straight away because it's easy. When someone is in trouble, it's very easy for us to offer up solutions. And no doubt, again, you've had this experience where you've gone to a friend to talk to them about some perhaps relationship difficulty you're having, and they offer up all these solutions, and you're trying to say to them, look, I don't really want solutions, I just want you to listen to me. Because very often our solutions are not the solutions for somebody else. And the worst thing you can do is offer up a solution, they go and do it, and of course it doesn't work, and they come back and say, it was your fault because you told me I should do this. So where should we start when it comes to trying to determine what's the best intervention? Where we should start is from, what do I observe? Or what do I see? So the very first thing to do with any client is just to be an observational researcher. I sometimes refer to this as the naive inquirer. I'm just looking and sort of at wonderment of the universe even to see, wow, I noticed that this person, this is how they operate in the world. That's really curious. How come they do that? I wouldn't do it, but how come they do? And before I say anything, the next thing I want to find out through these observations is make some hunches about what they are feeling. Now, many people will say, well, you'll put words in their mouth. Well, still, I haven't actually said anything. I'm not saying you're feeling like this. And I may not even be asking them how they're feeling at this point, because very often the answer you get when you say to people how you're feeling, they go, particularly adolescents. It's called the shoulder shuffling. Are you okay? So it is much better for you to think about, well, what am I seeing? I'm seeing this client sitting outside, sleeping rough. It's cold, it's raining. What are they feeling? Well, maybe they're feeling hungry, they're feeling cold, and they're feeling miserable. Now, if you know what they're feeling, the next thing you can ask is, what has happened to them? Not why are they doing this, but what has happened to them. This is their story or their narrative. Because when you can answer what has happened to them, then perhaps it's easier for you to be able to actually join together. I'll give you an example of this. So I see a young man walking down the street, swearing and cursing, and he's knocked over a rubbish bin. Now, part of me, as a good citizen, wants to say how inappropriate that is. How dare that person do that? I might even tell him to pick up the rubbish now. Could take that approach. However, if I use this reflecting solutions model, what I would say, what do I see? I see a young man who's just kicked over a rubbish bin for no apparent reason, and their body seems to be tight as they're walking. What are they feeling? Well, what might you feel if you're sort of kicking over, lashing out like that and kicking over a rubbish bin? They might feel overwhelmed. They may be feeling angry. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they're frustrated. What has happened to them? I could ask them, but just to say for this example that I noticed moments before that the young person was sitting down and trying to get some money or food for the day, and some other young people, well-dressed, walk past and were laughing at them and making fun of them, and they feel a great sense of shame. Now, if that is the story or the narrative that you create for this person, guess what? I'm pretty certain that the doing, that is what you do, or what we do together, the intervention you put in place is going to be very different. Fortunately, is most of us, and I'm not talking about, when I talk most of us in this sense, I'm talking about the community who don't do the work you and I do, are likely to see the person and straight away their doing is to judge the person, not to be interested in what might happen to them or how they're feeling at that moment. Don't just do something, sit there. I want you to spend some time looking at the way, and it's an invitation, looking at the way and how quickly you get into the doing in relation to your clients, or rather your ability to sit back and just be with your client. I want to talk now a little more about the pain and the work that we do. Spoken about this a little bit earlier. We have these 5 practice models that you can use to determine where are you in the work, that can help you create the frame. But remember, these models are not by their own going to give you the frame. The frame includes the models, the environment, how you know yourself as a person, and your ability to connect with your client in the way that we spoke about through Miriam Rose's work on Dadiri. So painful work. There are 2 ways to be in the world, either thriving or surviving. Thriving is your ability to be and help people to get into their thinking mind. Survival is reptilian brain. Survival in Maslow's hierarchy of needs is when we talk about those basic things of living, shelter, food, connection, relationship. When we think about the work, if we think about families and infants, children, young people and adults, those people, and hopefully this is you as workers, but those people who have capacity for openness will be the people that are thriving. What does it mean to have capacity for openness? Well, basically we're talking about an open mind, but we're also talking about somebody's ability to manage their stress and anxiety and worries, either because they have the skills and capacity to do that, or if you're a child, you have adults around you who are going to help you to do that. Now, hopefully, all of you out there have either been a child who had adults around you to help you through the world, and when you were feeling scared or anxious or worried about things, you're able to go to your parents or carers and say, I need help with this thing. Those of you who might be watching this webinar who in fact had some of the child adverse experiences that we've been talking about, it may have restricted your capacity to openness, because when you have an adverse child or living in those adverse childhood experiences like sexual, physical, emotional abuse and neglect, when you're in those environments, you're actually not thinking about, oh, I wonder what I can do today. I'll go and go to school and I'll learn lots of things. What you're thinking about is, am I going to be okay today? Is my partner going to hurt me? Is my mum or dad, are they going to hurt me? Is my big brother or sister going to hurt me in some way? Am I going to be laughed at school when I go into the classroom? Or sitting here on the street trying to get by maybe getting a bit of change from people or getting some food, are people going to laugh at me, look down upon me, belittle me? If that's what you're thinking of, then your ability to have a thinking mind and be open to the possibility of what might come your way becomes very much diminished. And most of you are likely to be working with clients in this space where the stress and anxieties and worries of their circumstance diminish their ability to be in their thinking mind. But this is also true in some ways for workers, carers, teachers, police, prison officers, community, society, and in general. If you are going to thrive as a worker, then you need to develop your ability for attunement and reflection. And your ability for attunement and reflection is connected to your ability to stay in your thinking mind and create a frame in the environment that you are in control of in relation to your client. Now, the only way you can do that is if your stresses and anxieties and worries in your own life are being managed. It's actually as simple as that. If you've got big stresses in your life at the moment, now, we could all think about COVID-19 because this is a real stressor that everybody has. And the chances are over the last 2 or 3 months, most of us as workers have had changed circumstances in the way we go about doing our work that has created another level of stress upon us. Stress by itself is not problematic, but the way we manage stress and our ability to have the capacity to manage stress is. Stress actually is a motivator. If you're hungry, and you experience hunger, that's a stress, or stressor, I should say. It motivates you, hopefully, to go looking for food. The only reason it should become problematic is if, in fact, you can't find any food. You live in circumstances where food is not readily available. But for most of us, it should be something that we can resolve quite easily. If our stresses, anxieties, and worries, and it's a bit like a seesaw, if the stresses and worries and anxieties in our own life are so great, it diminishes our ability for attunement and reflection, and it's going to be very difficult for you to be present for your clients. And it might, in fact, push you into your own form of reptilian brain, that is survival mode. You cannot do good work if you're in this state. It's not possible. And in fact, what can happen is that if we have a worker who has poor attunement and reflection because of their own stresses, anxieties and worries, who's working with clients who already have diminished capacity for openness to be able to hear, you end up with fuel on the fire. Fuel on the fire is not a state you want clients to be in, nor workers to be in. How do we overcome this? One of the most important things is good supervision for workers to ensure that if you do have things that you're trying to manage that are difficult in your own life, you have a place with which to talk to somebody about, either in your own therapy or with a good supervisor in your own environment, in your workplace. If you don't have the supervisor can provide you with that, then go looking for it, don't whinge and complain about it. Find someone who can provide you with what you need. It's your responsibility as a worker. Yes, organisations should, of course, provide good supervision, but the reality is we have mixed experiences of supervision, and partly because we get confused about what supervision is about, but that's another training. If you become the water on the fire, that is, if you have this great capacity for attunement and reflection, that you can hold the frame, blind in it, stay in your thinking mind, then in fact you do become the water on the fire. And what that means is you help the client to be able to manage their stress, to learn how to manage stress. As I said, stress is not a bad thing, it's our inability to manage it. And when you learn how to do this, then it gives the client the best opportunity to move from their reptilian brain into their thinking mind. It becomes a win-win for both. And ultimately, that's what we want. Good self-reflection from a worker to be able to develop the frame of attunement and reflection, which allows the client to develop this capacity for openness and to use their thinking mind to be able to determine what do they want to make from their life. So we've come to the end of the 5 practice models I wanted to offer up. I hope most importantly what you've gained from this seminar is the importance of the frame that you create with the client. And given the circumstances we currently live in, that is COVID-19, you might have to adjust your frame. And don't be scared to do this, but you have to work it out. Nobody can tell you what your frame should be. The only thing you need to listen to is feedback from the client that says the frame helps me, your frame that is, helps me to feel safe and secure. There's one other thing that I want to talk about briefly, and that's about outcomes and evolution. We have a problem within our sector, and by our sector I'm talking about in the homelessness sector, in the out-of-home care sector, working with children with complex trauma. And it comes back to what I said much earlier when the minister said to me, I like to be optimistic. That they couldn't actually say that the outcomes for children and young people and adults in dire circumstances are better than they were 40 years ago. Now the interesting thing is, in medicine, they can tell us this. If you have a look at this little graph I have here, in 1850, average age life expectancy was 36.6. In 2011, it was 78.7. We do know that within Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander populations, it's less than this. But in the medical sense, we're able to track those things. One of my concerns is this, and has been for some years: we track outcomes, what happened at the end of the journey sometimes, but we really track the vital signs, that is what's happening during the journey. And this is a failure of our system. If you're a worker, you should be taking the vital signs of your client, irrespective if they're a child, a young person, or an adult. Because you need to know whether the intervention you're putting in place is having an impact. It's too late at the end of your intervention to go, oops, that didn't work. There are always signs along the way with which we can determine whether or not an intervention has efficacy or not. One of the things we did here at the Australian Childhood Trauma Group, we developed some technology called Ripple, because I want to know, for example, are homeless people today better off physically, psychologically and spiritually than they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, whether they're an adult or a child. The Ripple technology allows us to determine this. It allows us to look at what's happening for the client as they go through the intervention to determine whether they're better or worse off. And what you're seeing here is a heat map of the journey of one particular client moving through a particular intervention. Ripple allows us to embed any framework. It doesn't have to be this particular one. This one we use for children, young people and young adults to determine what's happening for them as we go, and it allows us to see very clearly where our interventions should be placed and whether things are getting better or worse. If any of you out there who are watching this who are interested in tracking not just outcomes, seeing what happens at the end of the journey, but looking at the vital signs of the client as they move through them, please get in touch with me directly and I'd be happy to talk to you about this. Thank you so much for participating. It's question time, but of course you can't ask me questions live because we're not live right at this moment, but you can put your questions in the fields just below this video and I'll answer those as they come through. I'd like to give a big shout out to Melbourne City Mission for bringing this seminar together, or I should say webinar, and allowing people from different organisations to participate. We hope we meet you again at some point live where we will not have a broadcast storm and we'll be able to stay with you throughout the whole time of the webinar. There are many things for you to take away, and as I've said before in most of my trainings, training by itself is a waste of time. In fact, if you've watched this whole video, you've wasted your time if in fact you don't have a system by which to embed the learnings into your practice. Training on its own won't do that. The effort is now up to you to go away and get further supervision, do more training, and you'll practice this stuff and do some self-reflection when you have practiced the things that I've been talking about, and have a think about how you can embed them into your day-to-day practice. Most importantly, I hope there's some things you've taken away, and if it's nothing more simple than learning how to stay in your thinking mind, to breathe, to listen deeply, to connect, and to remember you can't hurry the river. Change takes time. Be careful out there, and I wish you all the best and see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
To know me is to breathe with me. To breathe with me is to listen deeply. To listen deeply is to connect. is the sound of deep calling to deep. Dadidi, the deep inner spring inside us. We call on it, and it calls on us. We are river people. We cannot hurry the river. We need to move with the current and understand its ways. We wait for the rain to fill our rivers and water our thirsty earth. We watch our bush foods and wait for them to open before we gather them. We wait for our young people as they grow. The time for rebirth is now. If our culture is alive and strong and respected, it will grow. It will not die, and our spirit will not die. I believe that the spirit of Dadidi that we have to offer will blossom and grow. Not just within ourselves, but in our whole nation.